Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins.
In the long and distant past, before the rolling fields of Rohan bore the name that would echo through the halls of kings and the songs of minstrels, there was only the wind, the sky, and the whisper of hooves upon the earth. The land of Calanardan, as it was once called, stretched vast and open, its plains unbroken save for the winding rivers and the occasional rise of hills against the horizon. It was a land waiting for its people, for a race noble and free, bound not by walls of stone but by the call of the open world. Far to the north, in the high vales beyond the great river Anduin, a people lived whose hearts beat in time with the thundering hooves of their steeds. They were the Eotheod, a strong and proud folk, born to the saddle, their lives intertwined with those of their horses. For them a horse was not a mere beast, but a companion, a brother, an extension of the rider's own soul. Their lands were wild and their winters harsh, but they were free, and in their freedom they thrived. It is said that in those days their chieftain was Liad, a great rider and a keeper of many steeds. Among them was a stallion unlike any other, a mighty white horse, swift as the rushing wind, untamed and unyielding. None could ride him, though many had tried, but Liad, bold and fearless, sought to claim him as his own. One fateful day he mounted the wild beast, seeking to bend it to his will, but the stallion, strong and proud, threw him from its back. The fall broke Leod's body, and there upon the grass, the great chieftain of the Eotheod breathed his last. His son Eorl, still young but already wise beyond his years, stood over his father's resting place with grief in his heart and a storm in his eyes. But his sorrow was not only for his loss, it was for the horse as well. For Eorl saw in the beast not malice, but a spirit as fierce and untamed as his own. He did not seek vengeance. Instead, he tracked the stallion for days, not with whips or snares, but with patience. He followed it through rivers, across hills, beneath the silver light of the moon, until at last the great white horse turned to him. And there, beneath the boundless sky, the two stood as equals. Eorl did not seek to conquer the stallion, but to know it, to understand its heart. And so it was that the mighty horse, whom he named Felaroth, bowed his proud head and allowed Eorl to climb upon his back. Never again would the stallion suffer a bridle nor another master. They rode as one, swift and unchallenged, their bond unbreakable. It was said that Felaroth could understand the words of men, that he and Eorl spoke not with voice alone but with heart and mind, and together they were unstoppable. Years passed, and the fame of Eorl grew, as did the strength of his people. But the day would come when a summons would reach him from a land far to the south, a call that would change the fate of the Eotheod forever. For in those days, Gondor, the mighty realm of men, stood in peril. Its lands were vast, its cities great, but the shadow of war loomed ever near. The steward of Gondor, Cirion, found himself facing a threat from the east, the Balcoth, a cruel and relentless people who had crossed the great river, burning villages and driving terror before them. Gondor's strength was not what it had once been, and Cirion knew that without aid his people would fall. And so in desperation he sent messengers northward across the wildlands, through peril and hardship, to seek the aid of Eor and his riders. It was a plea carried on the wings of the wind, a whisper of fate. Many of those messengers never made it, their bodies lost to the dangers of the wild. But one, weary and near death, reached the halls of Eor. The young lord listened. He heard the tale of Gondor's plight, of the shadow creeping upon its borders, of the flames that threatened to consume it. And as he stood in the great hall of his ancestors, his heart stirred. For though the Eortheod were free and bound to no king, honor called to him. He looked upon his people, his riders, men of courage, of fierce loyalty, and he knew what must be done. And so, beneath the cold stars of the northern sky, Eorl swore an oath. With Felaroth beneath him and his sword in hand, he would ride south. He would call upon his riders, every man who could bear a spear, every horse that could carry them. They would not stand idle while a great kingdom fell. For 5 days and 5 nights, the Eord, the great host of the horse lords, thundered southward, swift as a storm upon the plains. They rode through valley and mountain, across rivers and open lands, their banners streaming behind them, their voices lifted in song, a song of war, of glory, of the open world that stretched before them. And with every mile the air seemed to tremble, as if the very land itself knew what was coming. They reached the fields of Calenardon, where the armies of Gondor stood on the brink of despair. The Balcoth had come in vast numbers, and the men of Gondor, though valiant, were outmatched. The sky was dark with the smoke of battle, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. But just as hope seemed lost, the sound of hooves, mighty and unyielding, rolled across the plains like distant thunder. Eorl and his riders came as a tempest upon the enemy. They struck swift and without mercy, their spears gleaming in the firelight, their cries fierce and terrible. The Balchoth, who had thought victory within their grasp, found themselves shattered before the onslaught. The Eothiod drove them back, cutting through their ranks like wind through tall grass, until the enemy scattered and fled, never to return. When the dust of battle had settled, Cirion, the steward of Gondor, looked upon Eor and saw not just a savior but a brother. And so, in gratitude, he made an offer that would forever bind the two peoples together. He gifted to Eor and his riders the land of Calenardon, a land wide and open, rich in pasture and boundless in possibility. A land fit for the horse lords. Eorl accepted, and with that, the kingdom of Rohan was born. Its people, once wanderers of the north, now had a home of their own, where the wind ran free and the songs of their fathers would never fade. They built their great halls upon the hills, and there in the heart of their kingdom they raised their banner, a white horse upon a field of green. And so, in the golden lands where the grass whispered in the breeze, the riders of Rohan made their mark upon the world. They were no longer mere wanderers. They were a people, a kingdom, a legend. And the sound of their hooves would echo across the ages. The air above the wide plains of Calanardon hung thick with the remnants of battle, the scent of steel and blood still mingling with the earth, as though the land itself had taken part in the struggle. The sky, streaked with the last vestiges of dusk, seemed reluctant to surrender to the night, as though it too bore witness to what had transpired. Far beyond the golden fields, where the hills rolled like the great undulating waves of an unseen ocean, the wind stirred, carrying with it the echoes of hoofbeats, of voices raised in triumph, of the clash of swords and the cry of those who had fallen. But now, in the wake of war, there was a hush, a silence that settled over the land like the pause between heartbeats. Eorl stood upon a rise, Felaroth beneath him, the great stallion shifting his weight, his nostrils flaring as though he too could sense the turning of fate upon this land. The young chieftain, though victorious, was not untouched by the gravity of what had come to pass. He turned his gaze over the battlefield, where the bodies of the slain lay scattered like fallen leaves upon the grass, where the last embers of dying fires flickered like stars upon the earth. The men of Gondor moved among them, some to tend to their wounded, others to grant what mercy they could to those beyond saving. And in the distance, where the setting sun cast long shadows, Cirion, steward of Gondor, approached. Eorl did not speak at once. Instead, he watched the slow procession of Cirion and his guard, the way they moved as though burdened not only by the weight of their armor, but by something greater, something unseen yet inescapable. There was no joy in their steps, no lightness that might have come with victory. It was not the way of men to revel in war, even in triumph, for every battle left its scars, and not all wounds could be bound in cloth or healed with time. When Cirion reached him, he halted, his shoulders straight despite the fatigue that clung to him. His eyes, gray as the storm-racked sea, met Eorl's with something deeper than gratitude, something unspoken, something that carried the weight of history itself. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred between them, whispering through the grass, carrying the scent of the distant river, the murmurs of men, the quiet rustling of banners that bore the sigils of their people. At last, Cirion inclined his head, his voice measured, yet filled with something akin to reverence. "You have done what few would dare, Eorl, son of Leod. You have ridden through the wild, through peril and darkness, and you have come to the aid of those who had no right to ask for it. You have turned the tide of battle, saved my people from ruin. This day will be remembered, not only in the halls of Gondor, but in the annals of time." He paused, and in his eyes there was something thoughtful, something searching. "But tell me, Eorl, what is it that compels a man to ride to war for a land that is not his own? What force moves a people to sacrifice for strangers?" Eorl studied him for a moment, his fingers tightening upon the reins of Felaroth, though the grip was not of tension but of thought. The question was not one he had not asked himself, for in the long nights of their ride, in the moments where the stars wheeled above them and the only sound was that of hooves upon the road, there had been time to think, to wonder, to question the path he had chosen. He took a slow breath, his voice quiet yet resolute. Is it not the duty of those with strength to lend it to those who have none? Is it not the way of men to stand beside one another, to fight not for wealth nor for power, but for something greater, something that cannot be weighed in coin nor measured in land? Honor is not a thing that can be bartered, nor is it bound by the borders drawn upon maps. If we who call ourselves free do not rise to aid those who cannot stand alone, then what meaning does our freedom hold? Sirion regarded him, the flickering torchlight reflecting in his eyes, casting deep shadows upon his face. There was something in his expression, something that spoke of understanding, of recognition, as though Eorl's words had struck upon some ancient truth buried deep within him. He let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting to the horizon, where the stars had begun to emerge, faint and shimmering, like the distant lights of forgotten kings. "You speak with wisdom beyond your years, Eorl," he murmured, and for the first time that night, a small, weary smile touched his lips. "And it is wisdom that this world sorely needs." He was silent for a long moment. Then he straightened, his voice taking on the weight of command. "You have given more than we could have asked, and I would see that sacrifice repaid, not with mere words, but with something greater." He gestured outward, beyond the battlefield, beyond the river, beyond the rolling plains that stretched endlessly to the west. This land, Calenardon, has long been a province of Gondor, though its people have dwindled and its watch has grown weak. It is a land of open fields, of wide pastures and swift-running rivers. It is a land of riders, a land fit for a people who live by the wind and the sky. I would see it given to you, Eorl, and to your people, not as a gift, but as a bond, an oath between our houses, between our peoples, that as long as the white horse runs upon the green, the riders of the mark shall answer the call of Gondor. Eorl's breath caught, though he did not move, nor did he let the full weight of his thoughts show upon his face. He had not come to seek land, nor titles, nor kingdoms. Yet here, beneath the vast sky, upon a battlefield where honor had been proven not in words but in blood, he found himself upon the precipice of something greater than he had imagined. He turned his gaze outward, past Sirion, past the flickering torches and the watchful eyes of men, past the remnants of war and toward the land itself. It stretched before him, wild and unclaimed, a canvas waiting to be painted, with the hooves of his people, with the songs of their riders, with the stories of those yet to come. He thought of his father, of Liad, of the untamed stallion that had taken his life and yet had become the foundation of something greater. He thought of the long ride, of the nights spent beneath the stars, of the fire that burned in the hearts of his riders. He thought of what it meant to belong, not to stone walls nor gilded halls, but to the land, to the wind, to the endless sky. At last he met Sirion's gaze once more, and there, in the growing dark, he spoke the words that would echo through the ages. "We will take this land, and we will make it our own, and so long as the line of Eor endures, so too shall our oath. When Gondor calls, Rohan shall answer." And with those words, the kingdom of Rohan was born. The wind swept across the open plains, its voice carrying 1,000 unspoken promises. a song as old as the hills, as deep as the roots of the earth itself. The sky stretched above them in endless expanse, a vault of silver and deepening blue where the last embers of sunset smoldered on the horizon, casting the land in hues of quiet fire. The world stood poised between light and shadow, between the memory of war and the promise of peace, and beneath that vast and solemn sky, two men stood. One a steward of a mighty realm, the other the father of a people, yet unclaimed by history. Eorl did not speak for a long time. He let Sirian's words settle upon him, let them sink into the marrow of his bones, into the core of all that he was. He had ridden here expecting only to fight, to lend his sword to a battle not his own, to do what honor demanded and then to return to the high vales of the north. But now the world had shifted beneath him, and he found himself standing at the threshold of something greater, something unknown, something as wide and untamed as the land that stretched before him. His fingers brushed against the thick mane of Philaroth, the stallion standing steady beneath him, his breath warm, his great limbs restless, as though even the beast could sense the weight of this moment. He thought of the long ride south, of the countless leagues they had covered, the dust and sweat and toil, the endless beat of hooves upon the earth, like the pounding of a war drum. He thought of the men who had followed him without hesitation, who had taken up their spears not out of duty, not for gold or for conquest, but because they believed in something more, because they believed in him. And he thought of his father, of Leod, whose life had been given to the wild spirit of a horse, and of how that sacrifice had led to this moment, as though fate had woven their lives into a pattern that neither blade nor time could sever. He had spent his youth believing that his people were wanderers, that they were bound to the cold northern lands, to the misty vales and the high ridges where the wind cut sharp and the rivers ran swift and cold. But here, now, standing upon this open land, he felt something stir deep within him, something like recognition, as though this place had been waiting for them all along. At last he turned his gaze back to Sirion, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying with it the weight of a decision not lightly made. I did not ride south seeking a kingdom. I did not take up my spear for the promise of land or for the hope of riches. I rode because war had come, because there were men who called for aid, and because my heart told me that honor demands more than words. It demands action. And yet now, you offer me something that cannot be won in battle, something that cannot be taken, only given, a home, a future. He fell silent for a moment, his gaze shifting again, sweeping across the landscape, taking in the gentle undulations of the land, the way the rivers wound like silver ribbons through the fields, the distant dark line of the forests that bordered the realm. There was a quiet beauty here, something ancient and untamed, and in it he saw the reflection of his own people, the wildness, the freedom, the song of wind and hoofbeats that had guided them for so long. He exhaled, slow and measured. You ask what compels a man to take up arms for those who are not his kin. But I would ask you this: Syrian. What is kinship if not the bonds we choose? Are we not all of us bound by something greater than blood? By the land beneath our feet, by the songs we sing, by the battles we fight side by side? You speak of an oath, of a bond between our peoples, but I would say that bond has already been made. It was made on the field of battle, in the dust and in the moment when my riders charged and your men stood their ground. It was made in the way our swords met the same enemy, in the way our shields stood against the same storm. If we are to take this land, then let it not be as a prize of war, but as the fulfillment of something that was always meant to be. Syrian listened, and in his eyes there was something like understanding, something like relief, as though he had feared rejection, as though he had wondered if Eeyore would see in this gift something lesser than what it was. He nodded, slow and deliberate. Then let it be so. Let the white horse ride upon the green, and let our people stand together, now and always. And so it was that upon that twilight hour, beneath the watchful sky, Syrian swore the oath of Eorl, and Eorl in turn swore his own. No parchment was signed, no scribe set ink to paper, for such things were for those who feared that words might be forgotten. No, their oath was spoken before the land itself, before the stars and the wind and the rolling hills that would bear witness long after all men had passed into shadow. It was an oath of steel and blood, of fire and wind, an oath that would bind their fates together across the ages. The days that followed were filled with movement, with voices raised not in war but in preparation for something new. The riders of the Eothead set forth across the land, their banners streaming behind them, their songs carrying upon the wind. They rode through the fields, through the valleys, and the wide open spaces that stretched beyond sight, and with each league they covered, the land seemed to welcome them as though it had always been waiting for the thunder of their hoofs. They came to the great hill that rose above the plains, a place where the rivers met, where the winds ran free, where the earth was firm and strong. And there they built the Golden Hall, the heart of their kingdom. They named it Mediceld, and within its walls they laid the first stone of a legacy that would endure beyond time. Eorl stood upon the steps of his hall, looking out over the land that was now his, over the fields where his people had begun to settle, over the winding roads and the vast stretches of green. He thought of the years to come, of the kings that would follow after him, of the battles yet to be fought, of the songs yet to be sung. He knew that this land would know war again, that darkness would come as it always did, that the peace they had found would one day be tested. But he also knew that as long as the white horse rode, as long as there were riders to take up the spear, as long as there was wind upon the plains and fire in the hearts of his people, Rohan would endure. He turned to Felaroth, the stallion who had carried him through battle, through fire and storm, the horse who had once been untamed and wild, but had chosen him, just as this land had chosen them. He ran his fingers through the thick mane, feeling the warmth of the beast, the steady breath, the quiet strength. "We are home," he murmured, and though the wind carried his words away, he knew they had been heard. And so the land of Rohan was born. The golden light of dawn spilled across the wide plains of Rohan, stretching in long beams that kissed the crests of rolling hills and set the grasses aflame with hues of amber and gold. The wind moved like a whisper between the blades, stirring them in gentle waves, and the great banners of the newly founded kingdom caught its breath, rippling with the proud insignia of the white horse upon a field of green. From the high terraces of Meduseld, where the morning light shone brightest upon the golden roof, Errol stood alone, his gaze sweeping over the land that now bore the name of his people. Though victory had been won, though the oaths had been spoken and a home claimed, there was a weight upon him that had not yet lifted, a quiet and lingering thought that tugged at the edges of his heart like the last echoes of a dream before waking. He had led his people from the northern vales, had carried them across leagues of untamed land, had driven forth an enemy that threatened to consume the world of men. And yet, standing here, where the light reached every shadow and the sky seemed endless above him, he wondered if the true battle was only just beginning. Behind him, the doors of Meduseld stood open, the hall within still scented with the smoke of last night's fires, where the lords of the Eotheod had sat in council, speaking of the future that now stretched before them like an unbroken path. The great wooden pillars of the hall rose like the trunks of ancient trees, their carvings etched with the histories of a people who had always been wanderers, but who now sought to put down roots. For the long tables bore the remnants of feasts shared in solemn celebration, where mead had flowed and voices had lifted in song. Yet even in the warmth of that gathering, Eorl had felt the shape of something unseen, a shadow upon the road ahead. As he stood upon the threshold of his hall, he heard the sound of measured footsteps behind him, and he did not need to turn to know who approached. Framric, his oldest friend, his most trusted advisor, a man who had fought beside him in countless battles, who had stood at his side as they rode southward, who had been with him since the days when they were boys racing their horses through the wild grasses of the north. Framric was a man of quiet strength, his presence steady as the earth, his words slow but filled with meaning when he chose to speak them. "You look troubled, Eor," Framric said at last, stepping forward until he stood beside him, gazing out over the same land, the same sky. His voice was calm, but there was a note of knowing within it, a weight behind his words. "And yet I do not think this trouble is the sort that comes from war. We have won our battles, and the land is ours. But there is something else that holds you here, something you cannot shake." Jarl did not answer at once, but his fingers tightened slightly upon the hilt of his sword, his knuckles paling beneath the weight of his thoughts. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves upon the earth, the riders of the mark already taking to the plains, their laughter carried upon the air. It was a sound that should have brought him peace, but instead, it filled him with a quiet unease. At last he spoke, his voice low, thoughtful. I have spent my life believing that we were never meant to stay in one place, that our strength came from our freedom, from the way we moved with the seasons, never bound by walls or stone or the weight of a kingdom pressing upon us. And yet here we stand, with a hall built upon the hill, with lands given to us not by the will of the wind, but by the word of a man. We call this place home, but I wonder, can we truly belong to the land when we have not shaped it with our own hands? Can a people who have known only the open road find peace in stillness? Framric listened, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed upon the horizon. He did not answer at once, for he knew Eeyore well enough to understand that the words he spoke were not idle musings, but the echoes of something deeper, something that reached beyond mere doubts. When at last he spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful. There is a difference between being given something and claiming it as your own, Eeyore. Gondor granted us this land, yes, but it is not theirs to hold, not truly. The rivers were here long before their walls were raised. The hills have stood long before their kings took the throne, and the winds that run through these grasses know no master but time itself. The gift was not the land itself. It was the chance to make it ours, to carve our own place into the stone of history. We may have been given the right to be here, but what we do with that right is ours alone to decide. Eeyore exhaled slowly, his gaze following the distant shapes of his riders, the way they moved like shadows across the morning light, their steeds swift and sure, their banners streaming behind them. He thought of the oath of Eeyore, the words spoken upon the battlefield, the promise that bound them to Gondor in times of need. He had spoken them with the full weight of his heart, with the certainty that came from a bond forged in battle, but now he saw the depth of what he had sworn. It was not simply the call to war, the promise to stand when the darkness gathered. It was the promise to be something greater than what they had been, to build not only with sword and spear, but with hands and hearts. He turned to Framric then, a small, wry smile touching the edges of his lips, though his eyes remained heavy with thought. You speak as though you were born a philosopher, Framric, not a rider of the mark. Have the years upon the road made you a thinker? Or have you always known such truths and merely kept them hidden from the rest of us? Framric chuckled, shaking his head. A man who does not think is a man who will not lead for long, my friend. And you, he cast a glance toward Eorl, his expression knowing. You think more than any of us, though you do well to keep it beneath that armor of certainty you wear. But doubt is not weakness, Eorl. It is the forge in which wisdom is made. Eorl let out a breath, rolling his shoulders as though shaking off the weight of his thoughts. But he knew that Framric was right. There was no shame in questioning, no dishonor in wondering whether the path set before them was the right one. The true measure of a leader was not in the absence of doubt, but in the willingness to confront it, to shape it into something that could guide rather than hinder. The wind shifted again, and with it a new sound rose over the plains, the sound of a horn, deep and resonant, calling from the far reaches of the land. Eorl and Framric turned together, their eyes narrowing as they watched the distant riders approaching, their forms silhouetted against the rising sun. Messengers, by their bearing and the urgency of their pace, spoke of tidings that could not wait. Earl straightened, setting his doubts aside for now, for there was work yet to be done. The land had been claimed, the kingdom had been born, but the road ahead was long, and history was still waiting to be written. And so, with the wind at his back and the weight of a kingdom upon his shoulders, Eorl, son of Leod, stepped forward to meet whatever lay ahead. The wind swept low over the vast expanse of the mark, stirring the tall grass into gentle ripples, as though the land itself had drawn a breath and let it out in slow, patient waves. The morning sun, now fully risen, spilled its golden light upon the rolling hills, casting long shadows that stretched eastward toward the distant mountains, where the snow-capped peaks gleamed like the crowns of slumbering kings. The great rivers that ran through the plains, winding their silver paths toward distant Gondor, glistened in the light, and from where he stood atop the high terraces of Meduseld, Eorl could see them clearly, their waters moving with the quiet certainty of time itself. He exhaled slowly, his breath merging with the wind, his thoughts carried with it into the vastness before him. Somewhere in the distance, the cry of a hawk pierced the morning stillness, a lone hunter soaring above the fields, its keen eyes scanning the land below. It moved with purpose, unburdened by hesitation, knowing only the call of instinct, the unerring pull of nature that guided it from one place to another. Eorl envied the creature in that moment, for in its flight there was no room for doubt, no questioning of the path set before it. And yet, was not doubt itself the burden of those who sought to lead? Was it not the very thing that distinguished those who simply followed the course of the wind from those who shaped their own destiny? He turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, slow and deliberate upon the wooden planks of the terrace, and when he glanced to his side, he found Framric standing there once more, his gaze fixed upon the same horizon. There was something about his presence that had always been steadying, something that grounded Eorl in moments when the weight of leadership felt heaviest. The two men stood together in silence for a long moment, the wind curling around them, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves upon the plains, the rhythmic beat of riders moving across the land. At last Framric spoke, his voice quiet but thoughtful, as though he had been turning over his words before letting them take shape. "There is a saying among our people," he murmured, his arms crossed as he gazed out over the land. "The horse who has known only the wild cannot be bound without losing something of its spirit. And yet, if it is left too long to wander, it may never learn the strength of the bond between rider and steed, between trust and guidance. I have been thinking of this since we set foot upon this land, since we first laid the foundations of Meduseld and called this place our home. It is a fine thing to be free, Eorl, but it is another thing entirely to know what to do with that freedom once it is given to you." Eorl let out a quiet breath, nodding slightly, though he did not speak at once. He had always known Framric to be a man of measured thought, one who spoke not merely to fill the silence, but only when his words carried weight. And indeed, there was something in what he had said that struck deep. something that echoed the unspoken questions that had been turning within Eorl's own mind since the day they had claimed these lands. We rode south, Errol said at last, his voice carrying the weight of memory. We did so without hesitation, without question. There was no time for doubt when the call came, no room for uncertainty when the battle lay before us. But war is a simple thing in its own way. It demands action, it calls for strength, and in the heat of battle a man does not question his purpose. He fights or he falls. And yet now we stand upon the other side of war, and what lies before us is not battle, but the slow shaping of something greater, something that cannot be forged in a single stroke of the sword. It is a strange thing, Fraimric, to wield the power of choice, to stand before an open road and know that the path you take will shape the fate of those who follow. Fraimric was silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as though he too was considering the weight of those words. Then he let out a slow breath, his expression thoughtful. A kingdom is not unlike a great horse, Eorl. It must be guided with strength, but never with force. It must be allowed to run free, but never to the point of recklessness. And most of all, it must know that the hand upon its reins is one of trust, not of fear. You speak of choice as though it is a burden, but I would argue that it is the greatest gift a man can be given. For what is a leader who does not choose his own path? What is a king who is bound by nothing but fate? To lead is not to be carried by the tide of history. It is to carve one's own place within it. Eorl turned to him then, a small, wry smile playing at the edges of his lips. "And here I thought you were a warrior, not a philosopher," he said, though there was no jest in his tone, only quiet admiration. Fraimric chuckled, shaking his head. "A warrior fights for the present, my friend. A philosopher wonders about the future. But a king..." He glanced at Eorl, his expression more serious now, more knowing. A king must be both. Eorl exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to the land before them, to the rivers that wove their way through the plains, to the distant mountains that stood as silent sentinels upon the horizon. The road ahead was long, and he knew that there would be trials yet to come, storms yet to be weathered. But in this moment, with the wind upon his face and the land stretching out before him, he felt something settle within him. They had come here as wanderers, but they would remain as kings. And as the sun rose higher, spilling its golden light over the land of the horse lords, Eorl knew that the history of Rohan had only just begun. The sky over Rohan deepened into an endless ocean of blue, the golden expanse of the land stretching outward in every direction, vast and unbroken, kissed by the light of a sun that hung high and regal, its warmth spilling over the rolling hills. The wind, ever restless, whispered through the tall grasses, bending them in long, rippling waves, carrying with it the scent of earth, of wild flowers crushed beneath the hooves of passing horses, of the distant rivers that wound their way through the land like silver veins. It was a place where time moved differently, where the horizon felt as distant as the edge of the world, and yet, to those who rode across its plains, it was not an empty place, but a home as alive as the heart that beat within the chest of a steed at full gallop. Eorl rode slowly through the fields, fell off beneath him, moving with the quiet grace of a creature that knew its own power, the great white stallion's ears flicking with every shift in the wind, every distant sound that only his kind could hear. The land had been given to them, but it had not yet been made theirs, not fully, not until the marks of their passing had been woven into its very fabric, not until their hooves had left prints upon its soil, not until their voices had been carried upon its winds. At his side, Framric rode as well, his own mount a dark bay, its mane and tail catching the sunlight in streaks of red and brown, a fine beast bred in the northern vales, swift and strong. The two men rode in silence for a long time, letting the rhythm of their horses' strides set the pace of their thoughts, the steady drumbeat of hooves against the earth filling the spaces between words not yet spoken. They passed over hills where the grass stood tall, untouched by the hands of men, over valleys where streams trickled and sang, their waters glinting like scattered jewels beneath the open sky. At last it was Framric who broke the silence, his voice carrying not as an intrusion, but as an extension of the world around them, woven into the rustling of the wind, into the soft snorting of their steeds. It is a strange thing to look upon a land so open, so vast, and know that it is ours, and yet to feel as though we are only now beginning to understand what that truly means. We have fought for it, bled for it, ridden across its breadth and claimed it with our swords, and yet, still, there is something in it that remains untamed, something that watches us even as we watch it. Iril nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping the horizon, where the mountains stood like the shoulders of sleeping giants, where the distant forests whispered secrets older than memory. A land is not truly won in battle alone, he said at last, his voice low, contemplative. It must be known. It must be walked and ridden, must be lived upon, must be shaped not by steel, but by the hands that till its soil, by the feet that tread its paths, by the voices that call it home. We have been given a gift, but a gift unearned is like a horse unbroken. It will not carry you unless you have the patience to know its ways, to earn its trust. Framric let out a quiet breath, his fingers running lightly along the reins in thought. And do you believe we will earn it, that we, who have lived so long with the road beneath us, will come to know what it is to stand still, to root ourselves into the very earth, and not feel as though we are losing something in the process? Iril was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of the question itself, as though he had turned it over many times in his mind, searching for an answer he had not yet fully found. There is a fear in stillness, he admitted, his gaze distant. A fear that to settle is to surrender something of who we are, to become bound by something that will, in time, shape us into something we no longer recognize. And yet, I wonder if the fear does not come from the land itself, but from what we see in it. A reflection of our own doubts, our own longing for the freedom we have always known. But freedom is not the same as wandering, and home is not the same as a cage. I do not believe we are meant to forget the road, only to learn that the road does not always have to lead away. Framric considered his words, his brows drawn slightly in thought, the lines upon his face deepened by the light of the sun. Then perhaps it is not the land that must change, but us, he mused. Perhaps this is not about finding a way to claim Rohan, but finding a way to let Rohan claim us, to learn its winds as we have learned the ways of our horses, to understand its silences as we understand the hush before the charge, to listen before we seek to shape it. Eeyore let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You have always had a way of turning my own thoughts back upon me, Framric. A skill more dangerous than any blade. Framric grinned, but there was something softer in his gaze, something that spoke of understanding, of a bond that ran deeper than mere words. A blade can cut, but words can shape a man just as they can shape a kingdom. And you, Eeyore, are not merely a warrior anymore. You are the first king of this land, and it will be your words as much as your sword that will decide the shape of what we leave behind. Eeyore exhaled, his hands tightening slightly upon the reins, as though grounding himself in the moment. It was true, and he had known it, but to hear it spoken aloud was to feel the weight of it settle upon his shoulders in a way that no battle, no charge, no clash of steel ever had. He had always led with action, with the strength of his sword, with the speed of his riders. But now he would be called to lead with something far less certain, with patience, with wisdom, with the slow and deliberate shaping of a kingdom that would outlive him, that would belong not only to those who rode with him now, but to the sons and daughters of those yet to come. They rode in silence after that, the wind tugging at their cloaks, the sound of their horses' breath mingling with the rustling of the grass. And in that silence, Eeyore found something that had eluded him before. Not an answer, not a certainty, but an acceptance of the question itself. They had come as warriors, but they would remain as builders, as caretakers, as men who had not only claimed a land, but who had chosen to belong to it. And as they crested the next hill, the sunlight spilling over the land before them, the golden field stretching toward the horizon like an unbroken sea, Eeyore knew that their story had only just begun. The evening light stretched long and golden over the plains of Rohan, painting the rolling hills in hues of amber and bronze, casting deep wavering shadows across the land where the grass stirred like the surface of a restless sea. The wind carried the scent of earth and distant rain, the whisper of unseen things moving just beyond the horizon, the slow breath of the land itself as it settled into the hush of twilight. Far in the distance, the silhouette of Meduzel stood against the sky, its golden roof catching the last light of the sun, gleaming like a beacon in the growing dusk. Eeyore rode in measured silence, the steady rhythm of Felaroff's hooves pressing into the dampened soil, each step a reminder that they no longer rode as wanderers, but as men who had bound themselves to the land, who had sworn to shape it into something lasting, something greater than themselves. The thought lingered in his mind, winding through his thoughts like the rivers that carved their slow, patient paths through the valleys, shaping the land not with force, but with time. He had always known the weight of command, the way a leader must carry not only his own burdens, but those of the men who rode beside him. Yet this was something different. This was the weight of legacy, the realization that his name would not only be carried by the living, but by the stones, by the rivers, by the wind itself. Framric rode beside him, his own mount moving with the effortless grace of one who had known nothing but the open world since the moment of its birth. His face was quiet, thoughtful, his gaze fixed upon the distant hills. Though his mind was clearly elsewhere, he had spoken little since their last conversation, and Uorl had let the silence remain unbroken, knowing that there were moments when words served only to distract, when a man needed time to shape his own thoughts before giving them form. And yet, as the sky deepened, as the first stars began to appear, scattered like the remnants of a forgotten fire upon the darkening heavens, Uorl sensed that the time for silence had passed. "You have been quiet, Framric," Uorl murmured at last, his voice low, carrying only as far as the wind would take it. "It is not like you to ride so long without words. Have you found yourself lost in thought, or is it something more?" Framric let out a slow breath, his fingers shifting upon the reins, his gaze still lingering upon the distant hills. "Perhaps both," he admitted after a long pause, his voice thoughtful, weighted with something that had not yet fully taken shape. "There is much to consider, and much that I have not yet found the words to name. I have always thought of myself as a man of action, Uorl, a man who understands the world through the grip of a sword, through the beat of hooves upon the earth, through the certainty that comes with the clash of battle. And yet, now I find myself in a world that demands something else, something more." He turned then, meeting Eorl's gaze, and for the first time in many years, Eorl saw something in his friend's eyes that he did not often see. Uncertainty, not of purpose but of place, of the slow, shifting understanding that comes when a man realizes that the world has changed, and he must find a way to change with it. "We have won our battles," Framric continued, his voice quieter now, as though he spoke not only to Eor, but to himself. "We have taken this land, we have sworn our oaths, we have carved our place into the world. But what now? What is a warrior without a war? What is a sword without a battle to fight?" Eorl studied him for a long moment, feeling the weight of the question settle between them, feeling the way it reached beyond them into the heart of every man who had followed them here, every rider who had once lived by the road, by the call to arms, by the certainty that a day would come when steel would meet steel, and they would find their purpose in the storm of battle. "I do not think we were ever only warriors, Framric," Eorl said at last, his voice steady, measured. "Though we have lived by the sword, though we have shaped our lives upon the edge of battle, we have always been more than that. We are riders, yes, but we are also men of the land. We have always moved with the wind, with the changing of the seasons, with the shifting of the world itself. To live by war alone is to be bound to something that will in time consume us. But to live by the land, to know its ways, to understand its voice, that is something greater, something lasting." Framric was silent, but his expression was not that of a man unconvinced, only of a man who had not yet fully grasped the shape of the thought before him. The horses moved on, their breath misting in the cooling air, their bodies warm beneath the touch of their riders' hands. The world was quiet now, filled only with the rustling of grass, the distant call of an unseen bird, the slow, rhythmic beat of hooves upon the earth. "Perhaps you are right," Framric said at last, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had spent his life believing in one thing and now found himself standing at the edge of another. Perhaps we were always more than warriors, but it is not an easy thing to set aside the sword, to look beyond the battle, to see a future that does not begin and end with war. Eeyore nodded, understanding, for he too had felt it, that quiet fear that lingered in the heart of every man who had built his life upon the certainty of the blade. "It is not an easy thing," he agreed, his voice quiet, yet resolute, "but I do not think we must set it aside, only learn that it is not the only thing we are. There will be battles still, Framric. There will be wars yet to come. The world is not so kind that we will never be called to fight again. But when that day comes, let us fight not as men who know nothing else, but as men who have something greater to protect." Framric let out a slow breath, his gaze lifting once more to the horizon, where the last light of the sun had begun to fade, where the world stood poised between night and day, between what had been and what was yet to come. He nodded, and though he did not speak again, Eeyore knew that something had shifted, that a new path had begun to take shape, not only for Framric, but for all of them. The road ahead would not be easy, but they had never sought an easy road. They were riders of the mark, men of the land, bound to the wind, to the sky, to the endless expanse of the world before them. And as they rode onward into the gathering dusk, into the future that lay waiting beyond the hills, Eorl knew that they would find their way. The night had come upon Rohan like the slow turning of the tide, a quiet and inevitable descent of darkness that did not rush, but rather embraced the land in its careful, unhurried hands. Above the rolling plains the sky stretched endlessly, a vast canopy of ink-back velvet, strewn with the cold fire of 1,000 stars, each glimmering point a distant echo of something ancient, something waiting. The moon, pale and ghostly, hung low on the horizon, casting a silver glow over the world, making the tall grasses shimmer as though they were touched by frost. Though the air remained warm with the lingering breath of the day, Meduseld stood upon its high hill, its golden roof now a dull gleam in the dimness, its mighty wooden beams creaking softly in the night wind, the vast hall quiet now, but not lifeless. Inside, the great hearth still smoldered, the embers pulsing red and orange like the slow heartbeat of something vast and slumbering. The scent of wood smoke thick in the air, mingling with the faint traces of mead and roasted meat, of old stories told in the flickering firelight. Here, where the banners of the horse lords hung motionless in the stillness, where the carvings upon the pillars spoke of battles and oaths and deeds that would not be forgotten, Eeyore sat in the long hush that followed a day of council, his thoughts heavy upon him. His eyes traced the patterns in the wooden table before him, the grain of the ancient oak, the scars left by blades and goblets, by the hands of kings and warriors who had sat where he now sat, who had felt what he now felt. That quiet, lingering uncertainty that came not in the heat of battle, but in the moments after, when there was no more enemy to fight, no more road to follow, only the vastness of what lay ahead, unmarked and waiting. The silence around him was vast, but it was not empty. It carried the weight of history, of expectation, of something greater than himself. A shift in the air told him he was no longer alone. The door had opened almost soundlessly, and the soft tread of boots upon the wooden floor was as familiar to him as the sound of his own breath. Framric, his oldest friend, his most trusted companion, the one who had walked beside him through every storm and silence alike. Framric did not speak at once. He moved to the hearth, stirring the embers with the iron poker, watching as a faint flame licked to life as the shadows danced against the walls, their movements slow and thoughtful, like ghosts stirring from a long slumber. Then, without ceremony, he sat across from Eorl, resting his forearms upon the table, his fingers tracing idle patterns in the wood, mirroring Eorl's own unconscious gesture. "I saw the way you sat in council today," Framric said at last, his voice low, calm, but edged with the kind of knowing that only years of brotherhood could forge. "You listened, you spoke, but your thoughts were not with us. There is something that weighs upon you, Eorl, something that you have not yet given words to." Eorl exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, letting his fingers linger at his temples, as though pressing there might steady the shifting tide within his mind. "It is not one thing, Framric," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual, as though speaking too loudly might break something fragile. "It is many things. It is the shape of the future, the weight of what we have begun, the knowledge that we stand upon the first stones of something that will outlive us. And I wonder, have we built something strong enough to last? Or have we merely set the first pieces of a great house that will one day crumble, left to ruin by the hands of those who come after us?" Framric was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon the fire, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back slightly, his hands resting upon the arms of his chair, his fingers drumming once against the polished wood. "You have always looked beyond the present," he mused, his tone thoughtful, measured. "Even when we were young, when others lived only for the day, for the next ride, the next raid, the next battle, you always looked ahead, always saw the shape of things before they were fully formed. It is why you have led us here. But Eorl," he paused, shaking his head slightly as though searching for the right words. "You ask if what we have built will last, but that is not a question that any man can answer, not truly. You could carve this kingdom into the very bones of the earth, you could write our names upon the sky itself, and still, one day, time would take its due. It is not stone or wood or even steel that makes something endure. It is the will of those who come after. It is the stories they tell, the oaths they keep, the choices they make. And it is not the stories they tell, the choices they make." Eorl listened, his fingers curling into a loose fist upon the table, his mind turning over Framric's words, letting them settle into the spaces where his doubts had taken root. "Then what, Fremric?" he asked, his voice softer now, less burdened, but no less searching. "If we cannot ensure what we build will last, if we cannot bind the future to the shape of our will, then what is it that we do? What is it that truly matters?" Fremric let out a breath, his gaze finally meeting Eorl's, steady and unwavering. "We live," he said simply. "We ride. We build what we can, not for the sake of eternity, but for the sake of those who walk the path beside us, and those who will one day walk where we have walked. We take what we are given, and we shape it, not because we hope to be remembered forever, but because it is in the shaping that we find meaning. You wonder if Rohan will endure, but Eorhan is not the hall we sit in, nor the walls we raise. It is the land, it is the wind upon the grass, the sound of hooves upon the earth, the song of men who know the freedom of the open sky. And that," he exhaled, a small, knowing smile playing at the edges of his lips, "that will never fade." Eorl stared at him for a long moment, then let out a quiet, almost weary chuckle, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair, his own gaze drifting toward the fire. "You are wiser than you pretend to be, Fremric," he murmured. "Perhaps too wise for a man who has spent his life upon the saddle." Fremric grinned, reaching for the cup of mead that had been left upon the table, lifting it in a silent toast. "A man learns much when he spends his days watching the road ahead," he said, taking a slow sip before setting the cup down once more. "And much more when he spends his nights listening to the silence." The fire crackled softly between them, the shadows shifting along the walls, and for the first time in many nights, Eorl felt something ease within him, something unspoken but real. The road ahead was uncertain, the future unwritten, but perhaps that was the nature of all things worth building. And as the night deepened, as the wind moved beyond the walls of Medizeld, carrying with it the quiet, endless song of the plains, Eorl knew that Rohan was not only a kingdom, it was a living thing, bound not by stone, but by the will of its people. And that, more than anything, was what would endure. The morning was slow in waking, the sky hesitating at the threshold of dawn, as though reluctant to cast aside the heavy mantle of night. A thin mist curled over the golden plains of Rohan, its fingers reaching through the tall grasses, coiling around the gnarled roots of the ancient oaks that lined the distant riverbanks. The wind, gentle yet insistent, moved through the land like a restless spirit, stirring the fields in slow, undulating waves, as though whispering to the sleeping earth that it was time to rise. Eorl stood at the edge of Medizeld's high terrace, his hands resting upon the wooden railing, his gaze stretching out beyond the rolling hills, beyond the valleys that sloped gently toward the far horizon. The golden hall behind him was still quiet, the hearths within burning low, the scent of smoke and mead lingering in the air. the banners above him hanging motionless in the heavy stillness of early morning. The world felt poised in that moment, caught between what had been and what was yet to come, the weight of history pressing upon the land as surely as the sun would soon press upon the hills. A rider's silhouette broke the horizon, his form emerging from the mist like a figure pulled from a dream. The rider moved swiftly, his cloak billowing behind him, his steed's hooves barely seeming to touch the earth as they carved a path through the pale light of dawn. The sight of him stirred something in Eeyore's chest, a deep, quiet knowing, a familiar pull that came with tidings that could not wait. He did not move at first, only watched as the rider drew closer, as the figure took shape, his face still hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. The gates of Meduseld creaked open as the rider approached, and Eorl turned at last, stepping away from the terrace, his expression unreadable, his mind already moving ahead, already bracing for what was to come. The sound of boots upon the wooden floor echoed through the hall, each step deliberate, purposeful. When the hood fell back, revealing a face lined with weariness yet sharp with urgency, Eorl felt a slow exhale leave his chest. It was Hathold, one of his scouts, a man of keen sight and quick wit, one who had ridden far beyond the borders of Rohan, whose eyes had seen the shifting tides of the world beyond their own fields. "You have ridden hard," Eorl said at last, his voice even, though there was something beneath it, something watchful, waiting. "What news do you bring?" Hathor did not answer at once. He unfastened the clasp of his cloak, shaking the dust from his shoulders, his fingers moving with the slight tremor of a man who had spent many days in the saddle without pause. Then he lifted his gaze, and in his eyes Eorl saw what he had already begun to suspect. A shadow, something that had taken root beyond their borders, something stirring where the light had not yet reached. "There is movement in the west," Hathold said finally, his voice low, measured. "Not of men, nor of the beasts we have long hunted upon the plains. Something older, something that does not move as we do, nor speak as we speak. Yet it watches, it listens. I have seen fires in the deep valleys of the White Mountains, where no fire should burn. I have heard voices upon the wind, voices that carry no warmth, only the weight of something forgotten, something waiting." Eorl studied him, his fingers tightening slightly upon the edge of the table. The White Mountains were old, older than the kingdoms of men, older than the songs they sang, older even than the cities of Gondor that now stood upon the ruins of greater things. The mountains had always been a place of silence, of shadow, a boundary between the world of open fields and the world of stone and deep places, of forgotten halls and restless spirits. He had never trusted the stillness of those peaks, never fully believed that the silence there was the silence of peace, rather than the silence of something holding its breath, waiting for the moment to stir. "And what do you make of it?" Eorl asked at last, his voice quieter now, as though the words themselves carried weight. Do you believe this to be a sign of something greater, or merely the remnants of old ghosts, waking for but a moment before returning to their slumber? Hathold hesitated, his jaw tightening, his fingers pressing against the worn leather of his gloves. "I do not know," he admitted, and that, more than anything, sent a chill through Eorl's chest. "But I do not believe it is nothing. The land feels uneasy, the winds shift strangely, and I have seen tracks where no tracks should be, heavy upon the stone, leading toward the heights where men do not go." Eorl let the silence stretch between them, let the weight of the words settle upon the space they now shared. He did not fear the unknown, but he had learned to respect it, to listen when the land itself seemed to whisper of things unseen. There had been peace in Rohan since they had claimed these lands, but peace was never truly without its price, nor was it without its end. Framric had entered without a sound, his presence as steady as it had always been, his sharp gaze moving between Eorl and Hathold, his expression unreadable. He did not ask what had been spoken. He had already heard enough, already drawn his own conclusions. "So it begins," Framric said at last, his voice low, thoughtful. "We were fools to think that the world beyond our borders would remain still forever. The land changes, as all things do, but the question is, do we meet it as men who shape the storm, or as men who merely brace against it?" Eorl exhaled, the hint of a wry smile ghosting at the edges of his lips, though there was no humor in it, only the quiet acknowledgement of something he had long known. "We have never been men who simply brace against the storm, Framric," he murmured, his gaze returning to Hathold, to the shadow in his eyes. "Send word to the riders, let them know that the wind has shifted, and we must be ready." And as the morning light finally broke across the fields, spilling gold over the hills, filling the valleys with warmth, the first true test of Rohan's strength began to take shape. Not upon the battlefield, not in the clash of steel, but in the quiet knowledge that peace was never meant to last forever, that the world, in its vast and endless turning, would always call upon those who had sworn to protect it. Eorl did not fear that call. He had been waiting for it, and so, beneath the wide and watching sky, beneath the endless stretch of land that would bear witness to all that was to come, the riders of Rohan prepared once more to meet the world, not as men of hesitation, but as men of action, as men of the mark, as men who knew that the wind would always return, and with it the promise of what lay beyond the horizon. For so long as the white horse rode upon the fields, Rohan would stand,